Russia's Manpower Gamble. In every war there comes a point where on one side or even both the demand for men outweighs the supply. There are insinuations that Russia is approaching or already passing that tipping point. In this episode we peel back how Moscow is testing public obedience via propaganda, how earlier mobilization waves spurred a massive emigration, and how the system of conscription and hidden mobilization is creaking under the strain. Will Putin go for another wave of full mobilization, or is his regime too brittle to take that risk? Will a so-called hidden mobilization be the path he continues to tread? We'll examine how propaganda is preparing the ground for a new push, the failures, backlash and exodus triggered by the first mobilization, how Putin now leans on hidden mobilization, contract enlistment and annual draft roundups, the unequal burden on minorities and provincial populations, why the manpower pool is running dry, and how wasteful tactics make the shortage permanent. Propaganda is a pressure test before a conscription order lands, and propagandists are instructed to go into full recruitment sergeant mode. The regime needs to gauge how much social friction it can tolerate, unlikely to come in the form of organised protest, but it still fears chaotic pushback, new waves of people fleeing the country or going to ground, or even an uptick in partisan activity. That's where propaganda enters as a kind of stress test. In recent months, pro-Kremlin media have gradually amplified narratives that Russia is now under existential siege, that the patriots must stand and that everyone must share the load. You see it in state TV commentary, Kremlin mouthpieces warning of fifth columns, and in thinly disguised calls to duty. For example, in late 2025, several regional media outlets, undoubtedly controlled or co-opted, ran stories about how regional traitors or slackers are a threat to national unity. That's not new, but the volume and intensity have noticeably increased, suggesting the regime is raising the pressure. This is a pattern of regime signalling that has been flagged before by Mark Galeotti in his podcast In Moscow's Shadow, that propaganda, expansions, adaptation of narratives and intensification often precede coercive actions of one sort or another. These narratives act as a soft launch. We must all do more. Sacrifices are no longer optional. Those who evade betray the homeland. They prime the public opinion for harsher steps. If resistance is muted, Moscow can push harder. If backlash comes, it can recalibrate. What went wrong in the first wave and what it unleashed? The first full mobilization in late 2022, the partial referendum era mobilization, remains the reference point. It showed us the perils of overreach, mismanagement and a regime underestimating public reaction. Protests and uproar. In September and October 2022, mass protests erupted in dozens of cities. Russian conscripts and reservists rejected sudden summonses. Recruitment offices even began to go up in flames all over the country. Then there was the infamous mass emigration. More than 261,000 men reportedly left Russia to evade conscription. The Kyiv Independent notes this number in its coverage of 2025 draft announcements. Selective enforcement and arbitrary stops. Many in remote or ethnic regions were disproportionately targeted. The conscription machinery operated unevenly and often illegally. There was little recourse to law for those without means or influence. One academic study, The Mechanisms of Forced Military Enlistment, traced how coercion, manipulation of local communities, falsified medical exemptions and forced enlistment made its way into everyday practice. If truth be told, these are the methods of the Russian army since time immemorial. There has never been a strong and consistent basis in law for the drafting process or for how exemptions for service are approved. The paper argues that conscription mechanisms have become forced in many places, using pressure, legal distortion and outright coercion in some places. That's according to Taylor and Francis online. As the Migration, Integration and Activism Among Russian Immigrants report shows, many left in this period have no plans to return, explicitly citing conscription risk and persecution by the regime as major drivers. Some have, of course, returned, but it tends to be those in the larger cities which, for reasons of regime expediency and protection, have been saved from the harshest impacts of mobilization. Some failed to find jobs outside of Russia, and others found that they could get well-paid jobs working in the newly revived and sprawling military-industrial complex, which also gives some protection against being drafted, especially for those in the fields of engineering, programming and electronics. Hidden mobilization contracts and the annual draft. To avoid repeating that backlash, the Kremlin used subtler instruments, which especially target those without social power, leverage or connections, the poor, the disenfranchised, minorities of various kinds, those whom no one would speak up to defend against injustice.
Before we move on to the next question, I'd like to make a personal recommendation that I know you will appreciate. You may have seen my interview last week with the producer of the film series Kyiv of Mine, Ronnie Apteker. Well, I've partnered with them to help raise awareness of what I believe is an important series of films made for a Western audience to help break through absurd stereotypes about Ukraine, some of which, of course, are amplified by Russian propaganda. You can watch these films for free now. Details in a second. Kyiv of Mine is a documentary series about Ukraine's extraordinary capital, which I had the privilege to visit for the first time in January this year. The film production began in 2018, and of course much has changed since then. It's now 2025, and the story is far from over. Kyiv of Mine is a fast-paced, beautifully filmed, humorous, fun, insightful, heartbreaking, moving, and hopeful work. The very antithesis, in fact, of a doom-laden and worthy wartime documentary. This is a work that is extraordinarily uplifting. My friend, operator Starsky, says the film is made with so much love. The film series will make you laugh and cry. It's the only film about Ukraine that began before the war yet has traced lives through the tumultuous times, and which follows the lives of more than a dozen Ukrainians in real time. This is an historic period told through highly personal and emotive stories from Kyiv's days of emerging prosperity after the Maidan Revolution through COVID and the full-scale invasion. This film is a breath of fresh air. Ukraine deserves a better conversation in the world, one that isn't centered around war, says Jolyon Ellis, filmmaker on Kyiv of Mine. It's hard not to argue with that, and the filmmakers have fully delivered on this promise. This is essential watching for anyone who calls themselves pro-Ukrainian, but I think it's also vital to get friends, colleagues and family to watch it too, because the reality is few people have a vivid impression of Ukraine or any direct connection with its people. War is inhumane and abstract. Building an alternative perception is essential for engaging the world with the importance of Ukraine's struggle.
Hidden mobilization. Rather than overt mass call-ups, the regime leans on pre-selecting cohorts, pressuring local officials, deploying draft quotas in quiet, and enforcing by surprise summons. Contract enlistment, or kontraktniki. Instead of pure conscription, Moscow increasingly converts draftees or selects volunteers into contract soldiers, paying bonuses, offering promises of service terms, and binding them more directly to the Ministry of Defense. The Institute for the Study of War notes that Russia claims to have successfully increased contract service recruitment in 2025, but still needs to improve. Seasonal conscription cycles. Russia still runs its spring and fall military draft. In autumn 2025, Putin has decreed a draft of 135,000 men aged 18 to 30. That's according to the Kyiv Independent. In the autumn of 2024, that number was 133,000. Thus, this year's is ever so slightly higher. Although official statements claim that these conscripts will only serve on Russian territory and not be sent to Ukraine, independent reports suggest that pressure to sign contracts, which can lead to deployment, are frequent. That's in the Kyiv Independent. lawmaking to permit year-round conscription is a significant change that is proposed. In September 2025, the Duma passed a first reading bill to shift from seasonal draftees to a continuous year-round mobilization system. If adopted, this would erase the traditional breaks and make the draft permanent on a rolling basis. The regime knows that overt mass mobilization risks blowback, so it leans on legal tweaks, coercive pressure, and contractual incentives to push more men into service without triggering a mass uprising. Desertion, demoralization, and the limits of mobilization. Before we move on, let's pause and inspect a critical internal stress point in the conflict: desertion and breakdown within the Russian army. Mobilization may pump bodies into the front, but it can't always buy loyalty, morale, and cohesion. And in 2025, desertion is one of the most potent, silent challenges Moscow faces. Or what we know, the numbers, the estimates, the signals. First, the numbers with a grain of salt. A recent Forbes piece claims that more than 50,000 Russian troops have deserted or gone AWOL over the course of the war, based on a report by Ukrainian analysis group Frontelligence Insight. That figure corresponds to nearly 10% of Russia's total losses, including killed, injured, missing, according to Forbes. Front Intelligence itself, in its desertions and loss ratios, trends and forecasts summary, notes that most documented desertions occurred in 2023 to 24, but desertion may now form a significant share of Russian force attrition. It is hardly likely to have gone down. The Understanding of War ISW analysis also flags Russian efforts to clamp down. In 2025, Moscow has intensified punitive measures, expanded law enforcement's reach over deserters, introduced registries for conscription summons, and reshuffled command structure, all in reaction to perceived internal rot. That's from the Institute for the Study of War. On the ground, stories of soldiers fleeing their units, hiding, or refusing frontline deployment are increasingly common. The Barents Observer cites more than 95,000 cases of desertion or unauthorized absence since the full-scale invasion began. Sky News has documented individual accounts. Nikolai is one of the thousands of Russians who have deserted Putin's army. We obtained over 70 videos filmed by soldiers on the front line. During one battle, he decided to escape. It's quoted from Sky News. The Ukrainian intelligence report claims over 900 officers have been reassigned from front lines to rear areas, and at least 200 of them have deserted rather than accept the redeployment. The report frames this as evidence of deep demoralization and a leadership crisis. That's from the New Voice of Ukraine. And in Donetsk, the I Want to Live anti-war initiative lists cases of entire squads or stormtrooper battalions refusing to rejoin front lines, especially among convict stormtrooper units. That's from uawire.org. Finally, some first-hand narratives in Le Monde in May 2025. Two former Russia soldiers, Ilya Weizler, 22, and Danil Arkhipov, 24, described deserting because they concluded desertion was the only solution. Ilya recalled that his superiors were often drunk, fights were chaotic, and dissent suppressed brutally in the ranks. Danil described self-inflicted wounds as a route to escape. That's in Le Monde. Again, this is a tune I've heard before. In the 1990s, I spoke to many people in Russia who had faked wounds or inflicted real wounds on themselves, physical and psychological, in order to avoid serving in Chechnya, for instance, and also being mobilized into the army. Well, why this matters strategically and politically. Why it matters strategically and politically. Desertion is more than an embarrassment. It degrades Moscow's war machine in multiple ways. Erosion of effective manpower. When soldiers don't fight or refuse to return after leave, the nominal numbers pumped by conscription become illusory. Command breakdown. Desertions at the officer level undermine unit coherence, order, discipline, and trust in leadership. If officers don't trust their soldiers or vice versa, coordination collapses. then there is a kind of moral contagion. Each successive desertion or mass refusal can reinforce others' desire to flee, especially when state propaganda fails to counteract what men see happening in the trenches. Then there is coercion versus loyalty dynamic. The more punitive the regime becomes, harsher sentences, arrests, repression, brutalization, the more it signals desperation, which in turn may drive more soldiers to risk desertion rather than die under the brutal banner of Putin's genocidal invasion. Then there are international political optics. Admissions, leaks, or stories of desertion become ammunition for Ukraine's information war and the global framing of Moscow's legitimacy and its weakness versus its strength. I've often quoted the video interviews of Zulkin and Apostol, which attest to this. If you haven't seen them, the translations of them, they are fascinating. Then there are risks and uncertainties. Desertion, by its nature, is hard to quantify. Russian authorities suppress the data. Many desertions go unreported or are classified as AWOL. Some soldiers return later. Some are punished, others quietly reintegrated. Analysts also argue that desertion may be clustered in the most battered units, convict battalions, penal regiment troops, or badly equipped formations, rather than evenly across the entire Russian force. Moreover, the Kremlin is fighting back, intensifying enforcement, upgrading mobilization registries, punishing deserters severely. Desertion carries up to 15 years in prison, and also for some classes of AWOL there are lesser penalties. That's according to World Crunch. The regime is banking on fear, propaganda, and coercive discipline as counterweights. Still, the ever-growing chorus of defectors, the volume of court prosecutions, and the revealing individual testimonies all point to a significant internal stress line in Russia's war effort. Next, we'll turn to unequal burdens, minorities, and provincial extraction. One consistent pattern is the disproportionate pressure placed on rural, provincial, and ethnic minority communities. Consider Tuva. In coverage about soldier mortality per capita, Tuva stands out. In terms of soldiers confirmed killed relative to men aged 20 to 61 living in the region, Tuva has 120 dead compared to Moscow's 4 dead per 10,000 male residents. 120 compared to 4. That is a factor of 30. This is according to RussiaPost.info. Put simply, in remote, poor minority regions, the regime can conscript more people with less political cost. Citizens in Moscow, St. Petersburg, or better connected areas are less likely to be touched. Tuva, Bashkortostan, Pskov, Sverdlov, these are regions that are disproportionately supplying foot soldiers. That's according to RussiaPost.info again. Other minority or indigenous resistance groups have begun to push back. The Free Yakutia Foundation, for example, positions itself as a defender of Sakha identity and decries disproportionate conscription of indigenous men. That's from Wikipedia. Activist networks exist too. Get lost. Iditya Lesam. Go into the woods. An anti-war group based in Tbilisi says it has advised over 48,000 people on draft evasion and helped more than 2,000 to desert. Again, that's from Wikipedia. Hitting the limits of mobilization, running out of men, and rising costs. Even with all these wheels turning, the manpower pool is shrinking. Multiple dynamics conspire to bring this about. Age and health limits. Russia's formal conscription bracket, 18 to 30, is already stretched. The Danish Russia Conscription Report 2025 notes that Russia has extended the conscription age from 18 to 27 to 18 to 30 and is introducing more lenient medical thresholds to expand eligibility. Selective exemptions and corruption. Many are excluded via medical deferrals, educational status, or, of course, bribery. The Danish report also describes how corruption pervades medical evaluations and vojenkomat assignments. Vojenkomat is the military recruitment office. Contract payment demands to bribe, attract, or bind recruits, contract enlistment bonuses, have soared, placing strain on already stressed budgets. Over time, sustaining high bonuses becomes unsustainable. Then there is the attrition and casualty rate. The war's heavy losses further shrink the reservoir of serviceable men. Because of these limits, there's speculation that this year's conscription round could be the largest in years, possibly reaching into medically marginal, older or partially fit segments. Some voices even warn we may see conscripts who formerly would have been judged unfit, now reclassified or forcibly enlisted. As one analyst put it, the regime cannot afford to leave any stone unturned in extracting manpower. And indeed, we've seen many videos of clearly unfit and wounded people being returned to the front. Even with that, the manpower problem won't disappear because Russia's doctrine remains massive attritional warfare, with its accompanying high casualty rates, incremental and often strategically pointless gains, and reliance on overwhelming numbers. Wasteful tactics exacerbate the shortage, they don't mitigate it. Well, in the next segment, we'll look at the analysis of the previous mobilization and prognosis of the next one by independent observers. What is the likelihood of a fresh mass mobilization in Russia? Well, one of the more striking voices making a public forecast is Michael Naki. In his recent video, he assesses how likely mobilization is, under what constraints it would be rolled out, and what would push Russia from hidden to overt mobilization. Well, here is Naki's core thesis. Mobilization is probable, but conditional. Naki argues that the probability of a renewed large-scale mobilization in Russia is significant, though not inevitable. It depends on several stressors aligning: battlefield, setbacks, manpower depletion, fiscal strain, and the regime's risk tolerance. He suggests the regime may prefer incremental measures first, but is increasingly pushed towards a broad mobilization if attrition intensifies. In his framing, that line is being approached. The regime's ability to generate contract soldiers and hidden mobilization is nearing exhaustion. A trigger event, major territorial loss, high casualty rate, internal revolt, could push the Kremlin's calculus towards overt mobilization. He emphasizes the signaling logic. Pre-mobilization rhetoric and propaganda serve to test reaction and reduce the political cost of eventual mobilization. Naki's view is that a full mobilization is not guaranteed this autumn, but it is likely in the next 6 to 12 months unless Russia finds an alternative method to stem manpower decline. There are key variables in his model. Naki's forecast rests on a few of those: attrition rates and frontline losses. If Russian military losses spike due to failed offensives or Ukrainian counterattacks, that forces the regime's hand. Contract recruitment limits. At some point, paying bonuses, adding incentives, and enticing recruits via contracts fails, either because the inducements become unaffordable or because the pool of willing men is too small. Then there's public pushback. Although the regime suppresses dissent, widespread protests, or more likely emigration pressure amplify the costs of mobilization. The more visible evasion or resistance is, the more careful will be the timing of any mobilization. Remember, these would not be anti-war protests, but an expression of dissatisfaction with being compelled to participate in the war with its high rates of mortality. Fiscal stress and budget crisis. If the state's revenues or financial reserves shrink significantly, then Putin's options narrow, forcing a shift towards manpower-based solutions. Then we do have to also consider so-called elite consensus and fragmentation. The regime needs elite backing, including the Siloviki and the army. If factions or security services resist, unlikely, I must admit, but if they do, then mobilization becomes harder to enact coherently. Naki gives more weight to the military and fiscal variables, of course, because that's where coercive necessity becomes undeniable, but he also flags the propaganda toolkit, how much the public is being prepared. If propaganda intensifies, it signals regime readiness to push harder. So there are reactions, strengths, and some caveats. Well, this is grounded in some kind of regime logic, not wishful thinking. Nucky treats the Kremlin as a rational actor, but under constraints, not an irrational one. He respects potentially diverging contingencies. The regime will try to avoid full mobilization, resorting first to hidden incremental steps. Their indecision is based on events and reactions that are still not clear. He links mobilization to specific triggers. We can imagine for ourselves what those may be: battlefield changes, fiscal pressure, or political events which may affect the decision-making model. There are, however, caveats and critiques. Nucky's forecast is ultimately speculative. Without any internal regime leaks or memos, then these are just probabilities and estimates. This, of course, is true of any analysis of Putin's decision-making process. Of course, he may underappreciate social backlash, that even a small mobilization misstep could cascade into mass desertion and collapse of military order at the front too. And Nucky's timeframes, 6 to 12 months for this, may be too generous if sudden shocks force accelerated mobilization. Finally, his model assumes the regime retains enough coercive capacity, that is, security services, suppression, etc., to manage the backlash, which may be weaker than he projects. Well, let's turn to forecasts that slightly contest this view. Nucky versus Vlad Vexler and potentially others on Russian mobilization. We've already walked through Michael Nucky's forecast that mobilization is not inevitable, but increasingly probable. Hidden mobilization is being pushed to its limits, and a trigger event could force overt conscription within months. Now let's place his view in contrast with other analysts, especially Vlad Vexler, to sharpen what we can and can't credibly say. Vlad Vexler, as many of you know, is a political social philosopher and commentator. He focuses not only on military mechanics, but on political logic, well, actually more on the latter, as he is not a military expert. For him, the war is about regime survival, and it's that mode that will define their thinking, the psychological pressure and escalation traps. Vexler's commentary appears in several videos, for instance, Putin's Thinking and the Russian People Today. That's from his channel on YouTube. He frames the war not just as a contest over territory, but as a regime survival project, and mobilization becomes one tool of that survival logic. Where Nucky and Vexler broadly agree, the regime prefers to delay overt mobilization as long as possible. Both see hidden incremental pressure as the first resort. Mobilization is tied to external and internal stress. That is, battlefield failures, fiscal strain, and elite discontent push the regime toward more drastic measures. Propaganda and signalling are the key. Both expect intensifying rhetoric, messaging, and staged debates about duty and sacrifice to precede any mass call-up. There are early signs of this already, as we've noted earlier. Also, manpower exhaustion is real. Neither forecasts a bottomless pool. Both assume limits on recruitment, fitness, and willingness to fight. Then there is the budgetary strain to consider, and eventually the non-payment of wages, which will act as a disincentive for new kontraktniki to be sucked in to this military machine. Again, there are sporadic signs already of non-payment of wages and bonuses, and indeed death payments to families. There are critical fault lines between Nucky's forecast and Vexler's framing. He frames the war not just as a contest over territory, but as a regime survival project. Mobilization becomes one tool of that survival logic. Where Nucky and Vexler broadly agree, the regime prefers to delay overt mobilization as long as possible. Both see hidden incremental pressure as the first resort. Mobilization is tied to external and internal stress. That is, battleground failures, fiscal strain, and elite discontent push the regime toward more drastic measures. Propaganda and signaling are key. Both expect intensifying rhetoric, messaging, and staged debates about duty and sacrifice to precede any mass call-up. There are, of course, early signs of that already. Also, manpower exhaustion is real. Neither forecasts a bottomless pool. Both assume limits on recruitment fitness and willingness to fight. Then there is the budgetary strain to consider, and eventually the non-payment of wages, which will act as a disincentive for new kontraktniki to be sucked into the war machine. Again, there are sporadic signs already of non-payment of wages and bonuses and some death payments to families. But there are critical fault lines between Naki's forecast and Wechsler's framing. Time horizon and urgency are too. For Naki, mobilisation is likely within 6 to 12 months. If conditions worsen, he sees some buffer but not indefinite postponement. For Wechsler, the pressure is more immediate. The war is already existential for Putin's regime. He suggests that Putin may feel he cannot stop, and the regime is already edging toward more aggressive escalation. In his commentary, the war is less a matter of whether mobilisation comes, more it is to do with how soon and on what terms. See his video, Putin's Thinking and the Russian People Today. That's on YouTube. It's because of the urgency that more discrete tools may be used, such as scaling up of hidden mobilisation and the rapid move to rolling conscription rather than seasonal intakes at present. Focus on regime survival versus military necessity. Naki frames mobilisation largely as a function of necessity. When contract and incremental recruitment fail, the state must draw deeper on conscripts. Wechsler, however, views mobilisation more through a political security lens, as a regime tool expressive of existential logic. Mobilisation is not just to replenish losses, it is a signal that the regime cannot step back from the brink, that it must escalate, lest retreat is read as weakness. Wechsler often speaks of escalation as a trap. Once you push, you cannot stop. The need intensifies rather than abates. The movement is only in one direction, inexorably towards escalation. In effect, Naki's forecast asks when mobilisation becomes necessary in the context of the war aims, but Wechsler asks when the regime becomes unable to choose otherwise, because the internal logic of escalation will not permit a retreat. To round this out, let's bring in a few additional reference points to triangulate. Crisis group, open source analysts, rumours of mobilisation frequently surface in Crisis Watch listings. For example, a Bloomberg report in August 2022 noted that hardliners in Russia's security services were pushing for changes to the army, including stronger draft laws. This was in the Crisis Group report. Some think tanks warn that overt mobilisation is extremely risky. Politically, others suggest that only drastic conscription can sustain Russia's war strategy. Well, what these differences reveal? One, risks in prediction. The contrast between Naki and Wechsler expose key uncertainties. One is the regime psychology, which is extremely opaque. Even experienced commentators must guess whether Putin and his inner circle fear backlash more than battlefield collapse. Two, trigger sensitivity varies. A sudden military reversal or internal revolt might force acceleration. A slower grind might give the regime some pause or delay. Feedback effects are non-linear. Resistance, emigration or protest may tip the balance faster than any forecast assumes, and that may affect how the regime reacts. It could go in one of two ways, including a doubling down or a complete reversal of any mobilisation policy. 4. Risk of incremental policies. The regime may try half measures, contract hikes, hidden quotas, and only gradually escalate, obscuring what constitutes mobilisation as a concept. It'll be mobilisation by any other name, but it'll be more difficult to recognise it as such. Well, putting these forecasts side by side gives us a toolkit. We can map what to watch for as indicators that mobilisation is becoming unavoidable. These include sudden spikes in casualty reports, escalated propaganda campaigns with the themes of sacrifice, duty, and everyone must serve. We should watch out for draft law amendments or emergency session proposals, surprise regional draft quotas or localised mobilisation precedents. Elite infighting, leaks or critiques about resource strain are also something we should keep an eye out for, as well as a surge in immigration or evasion stories. If we begin seeing multiple of these signals, especially in a compressed time frame, the regime may be crossing Nucky's threshold or falling into Wechsler's logical trap. What's clear, Moscow is testing social limits via propaganda, trying to make conscription incremental, shifting to contracts and quiet quotas, targeting marginalized communities and straining manpower reserves. This will not be enough, and these structural pressures are mounting as Putin progressively both loses this war and overtly fails to achieve any of the objectives that he set when mounting it.
A final word from our partners, the makers of Kyiv of Mine. All 3 films are now available to watch for free on YouTube. Please check out the links to the dedicated website, which tells you more about the film, its subjects, and the filmmakers. Also in the description is a link to the YouTube channel where you can watch the films now. Do let us know in the comments what you think of them and if they inspire you as much as they have inspired me.